The facts about the evacuation are swiftly spelt out. Just over 338,200 troops, of whom 150,200 were French, were brought out through Dunkirk, mainly between May 26th and June 4th, and crossed the Channel to Britain in naval ships and in a flotilla of small craft assembled for the occasion. Churchill, addressing the House of Commons, described the operation accurately and succinctly as a colossal military disaster, and privately General Ironside, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, went further. He told Anthony Eden, "This is the end of the British Empire." Nothing had prepared British public opinion for what a defeat of this magnitude. Alexander Worth, a war correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, writing after the collapse of France, described the feeling of guilt at the soft soap he had been feeding his readers. It would be wrong to suggest that in the face of disaster of Dunkirk, an organized campaign now began to change the evacuation into a victory. But the newspaper reader of the day would certainly be forgiven for thinking that something wonderful had happened to British fortunes in the war. "Bloody marvelous," said the Daily Mirror. The Sunday Dispatch suggested that divine intervention had been responsible. It pointed out that Dunkirk had followed a nationwide service of prayer, and that during the evacuation, the English Channel, that notoriously rough stretch of water which has brought distress to so many holiday-makers in happier times, became as calm and smooth as a pond. And while the smooth sea was aiding our ships, a fog was shielding our troops from devastating attack by the enemy's air strength. The staid New York Times could not contain its admiration. "So long as the English tongue survives, the word Dunkirk will be spoken in reverence, for that harbor such a hell as never blazed on earth before. At the end of a last battle, the rags and blemishes that had hidden the soul of democracy fell away. There, beaten but unconquered, in shining splendor, she faced the enemy." Ed Murrow of CBS tried to put the evacuation into perspective. "There's a tendency to call the withdrawal a victory, and there will be disagreement on that point." Drew Middleton of the Associated Press wrote on similar lines. The censors did not interfere with their assessments, but in Britain the flow of what Middleton has called the hearts and flowers writing went on unchecked. One reason for this was that there were no British war correspondents writing from Dunkirk. David Devine, a freelance who had written a few Navy propaganda books, persuaded the Navy to let him watch the evacuation. Devine was wounded and wrote his well-known book on Dunkirk from his hospital bed. Although Devine later became a war correspondent of note, he was not one at the time. They covered the whole of the evacuation second-hand from the southeast coast, ports where the troops landed. There, the correspondents described the condition of the soldiers. "Grimy, unshaven, and tired, but there is no dejection," and did their best to piece together what had happened across the Channel. They were given a lead by government statements. "When the full story can be told, it will surprise the world," the Admiralty spokesman said, while the Minister of Shipping, describing the part played by the armada of boats, said, "It grips our imagination, it inspires our minds, and it tears at our heartstrings." And it was in this tenor that the correspondents wrote their stories, of a unit of guards drilling at the water's edge while they waited for embarkation, of officers bringing order to panic-stricken French troops at revolver point, of a sailor digging a bullet out of his leg with a sheath knife, of a company of Royal Warwicks who refused to leave the beaches until they had regulation haircuts, of dispatch riders putting on a display of motorcycle acrobatics as the Stuka swooped, of the many games of cricket in the sand. Above all, The stories stressed the high morale of the evacuated troops, itching to get back to France and into the fight again. No doubt much of this reporting was true. There were brave and noble deeds at Dunkirk, and they rightly were written about. But was this the full picture? What of those stories that, for reasons that will become obvious, were not reported at the time? It was not until the late 1950s and early 60s, nearly 20 years after the event, that a fuller, truer picture of Dunkirk began to emerge. In 1961, the author Richard Collier published the results of his long research into what had really happened at Dunkirk. Collier and his assistants interviewed 1,070 eyewitnesses and had access to the private papers of the commander of the BEF, Lord Gort, who, apart from his official dispatches, had never written a word about Dunkirk. Collier's conclusions caused bitter official reaction, but were never rebutted. He quoted accounts of a hotel cellar in Dunkirk packed with British, French, and Senegalese troops singing, weeping, and screaming drunk, of groups of men, deserted by their officers, prowling the town in a mood of savage violence, of a major shot dead through the forehead by another because it was the only way of preventing him from capsizing an already overloaded rowing boat, of a senior officer refusing to leave a foxhole he had dug in the sand, of a corporal of the guards who kept order in his boat, filled with fear-crazed troops, by threatening to shoot the first one who disobeyed him. And as for the survivors, arriving in Britain, itching to return for another crack at the enemy, this may have been true of the army as a whole, but Collier found a Kentish police inspector, Richard Butcher, who remembered only the sight of dispirited men hurling their rifles from the trains carrying them from Dover. In 1962, General Sir Harold E. Franklin, who had been a divisional commander at Dunkirk, complained that the evacuation had been over-glamorized. He said reports of merciless bombing and the hell of Dunkirk were quite ridiculous. I walked along the beaches on several occasions and never saw a corpse. There was very little shelling, much the same as Armentières on a quiet day in 1915 or 16. As for cowardice, General Franklin wrote, "In every unit there are some men who have no stomach for the fight. There are instances of a few men embarking at Dunkirk when their battalions were fighting near the canal." In 1965, Sir Basil Liddell Hart, the military historian, dealt the legend a body blow by stating that Dunkirk need not have happened. Never was a greater disaster more easily preventable. Liddell Hart pointed out that the German breakthrough that led up to Dunkirk, reported at the time being so overwhelmed due to overwhelming superiority, was actually achieved with armies inferior in numbers to those opposing them. Even in tanks, the German had fewer and less powerful ones than the Allies. Hitler's generals had been successful in forcing Dunkirk on the Allies because the tradition-bound attitude of the Allied officers. Liddell Hart illustrates this view with the story of a French soldier who sought permission to block the roads to the German tanks by felling trees across them, only to be told that the roads had to be kept clear for the advance of the Allied cavalry. The French role at Dunkirk was never properly presented in Britain, and the slanders on French troops reported at the time were never properly redressed. There were, no doubt, incidents of French cowardice, just as there were incidents of British cowardice, but 50,000 French troops stood fast at Lille, and although surrounded, managed to hold off 7 German divisions from Dunkirk for 4 vital days. The French Navy, assisting in the evacuation and complete with its own armada of civilian and fishing craft, lost almost as many ships as the Royal Navy, yet carried some 50,000 troops across the Channel. The French have since complained that not only was this contribution not reported at the time, but it was not really acknowledged in the British official war history. If Dunkirk was a miracle, then it had to be a British miracle. Almost In a class with Dunkirk among endearing legends of the Second World War were those events that began the fall of France in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Again, there is no dispute as to the facts. The Battle of Britain began on July 10th with attacks by the Luftwaffe on convoys passing through the Straits of Dover. The BBC war correspondent, Charles Gardner, broadcasting live from Hellfire Corner in Kent, set the tone for the reporting that was to follow. His voice raised in high excitement, Gardner described the dogfight in the manner of a football commentator. Later, German PK radio reporters broadcasting live from bombers over London were equally enthusiastic. "There's one coming down in flames. There, someone's hit a German, and he's coming down. There's a long streak, and he's coming down completely out of control. A long streak of smoke. Ah, the man's bailed out by parachute. The pilot's bailed out by parachute. He's a Junkers 87, and he's going to slap into the sea, and there he goes, smash! Oh boy, I've never seen anything so good as this. The RAF fighters have really got those boys taped." By August, when it was clear that the Luftwaffe was about to extend its operations to Britain herself, the RAF had caught something of Gardner's tone, and the order of the day, read aloud to every pilot, contained this stirring passage: "The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Members of the Royal Air Force, the fate of generations is in your hands." The legend goes like this: while England stood alone, the RAF, outnumbered and down to its last cartridge, with brilliant improvisation, skill, and unbelievable bravery, soared into battle with a smile on its lips and shot the Luftwaffe out of the sky, while Spitfires traced patterns over southeastern England, fighting to save the country from invasion. Down below, the Cockney newspaper sellers chalked up on their billboards the "ours" and "theirs" losses like cricket scores. "Biggest raid ever. Score 78-26, England still batting." When the Germans, frustrated in their attempts to knock out the RAF airfields, switched to attacks on centers with large civilian populations for 76 consecutive nights, excepting November 2nd, when the weather was bad, London was raided, but, as one American correspondent wrote, "It was thumbs up and carry on." St. Paul's Cathedral and the House of Commons were hit. Flames lit the sky. "Send all the bloody pumps you've got," shouted the fire officer at Surrey Docks. "The whole bloody world's on fire." Cockneys wisecracked as their streets disappeared in a shower of rubble, while the old and the children marched off to air raid shelters, singing "Bless him all." And all the time, Britain's war leader, Winston Churchill, captured the spirit of the people with his evocative speeches. "So many to so few, blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and fighting on the beaches." Like all legends, there is some truth in this. As far as the facts go, the average life expectancy in the air of a British fighter